A warm welcome to the students of BCom first semester. This session is about the subject Corporate Structure and Administration. The unit which I'll be covering is on Unit 2, Capital of a Company. The topic for today's discussion is kinds of shares. Dear students, in this session, the contents which I'll be covering is introduction, meaning of shares, kinds of shares, and the most likely questions in your examination. In the previous session, we discussed much about the various types of share capital. Now, let's understand in brief about shares. The joint stock company is a big form of business organization. The amount required by the company for its business activities is raised by issue of shares. The amount so raised is called share capital or capital of the company. It may be noted that a company limited by shares will have share capital. A company limited by guarantee or an unlimited company may not have any share capital. The persons who buy the shares of the company are called shareholders. A corporation's share capital or capital stock in US English is the portion of a corporation's equity that has been obtained by the issue of shares in the corporation to a shareholder, usually for cash. So with this introduction, now let's understand the meaning of shares. As per the Companies Act 1956, a share is a share in the share capital of a company. I just now told you about the meaning of share capital. So the share which is being issued or purchased by the individual will be invested and forms a capital of a company. There are different kinds of shares or types of shares. The different kinds of shares which can be issued by companies are equity share, preference shares, and deferred shares. In this session, I will explain the various kinds of shares. Let's begin to understand the first type of shares, which is equity shares. The equity shares or ordinary shares are those shares on which the dividend is paid after the dividend on fixed rate has been paid on preference shareholders. Equity shareholders are also referred as the owners of the company. It is also referred as ordinary shares. So the first dividend is paid to the preference shareholders. Later, the dividend is paid for equity shareholders. So it's necessary for you to know the characteristics or features of equity shares. There is no fixed rate of dividend to be paid. So dividend is paid after dividend at a fixed rate is paid to preference shareholders. In case of liquidation, liquidation means closure of a company or winding up of a company. Capital on equity is paid after preference shareholders have been paid back in full, and these shares are non-redeemable. Equity shareholders have a special right which is voting rights, and therefore they have a control about the working of the company. This right is not given to preference shareholders. As I mentioned earlier, equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. The next type of shares which you have to know is preference shares. Preference shares are those shares which carry with them the preferential rights for their holders. That is, preferential rights as to fixed rate of dividend and as to be repaid of capital at the time of closure or winding up of the company. As the very name says, preference, the importance is given to these shareholders and they get the benefit of dividend to be paid first. Let's understand the characteristics or features. The preference shareholders get the benefit of fixed rate of dividend, and the priority as to payment of dividend is first given to these shareholders. Preference as to repayment of capital during liquidation of the company. Generally, preference shareholders do not have any voting rights. Voting rights are only with the equity shareholders. So, according to the Companies Amendment Act of 1988, the preference shares can be redeemable and the maximum period for which they can be issued is 10 years. Hope you have understood the meaning of preference shares. Let's move on to the third and the most important concept is kinds of preference shares. First, on the basis of cumulating of dividend. Cumulative preference shares and non-cumulative preference shares. So cumulative are those shares on which the dividend at a fixed rate goes on accumulating till it is all paid, accumulating or cumulating. Non-cumulative preference shares. These are those shares on which the dividend does not get accumulated or cumulate. First kind is on the basis of cumulating of dividend divided into two, cumulative preference shares and non-cumulative preference shares. Let's understand the next kind on the basis of participation. Again, we have two classification here, participating preference shares and non-participating preference shares. So dear students, kindly concentrate on these distinctions. Participating preference shares. This type of shares are allowed to participate in surplus profits. Do companies definitely make profit and it will also be surplus? In such cases, they can participate in the surplus of the company and surplus assets during winding up. Non-participating preference shares. These shares are not entitled or eligible to participate in surplus profit. So they receive dividend only at a fixed rate which is given. Hope you have understood the kinds of preference shares on two categories. One is on the basis of accumulating of dividend, the next on the basis of participation. Let's move on. Again, we have the other basis of classification on the basis of conversion. Convertible preference shares and non-convertible preference shares. Convertible preference shares. The owners of these shares have the option to convert their preference shares into equity as per the terms of issue given. So they can convert their preference shares into equity. Non-convertible. The owners of these shares do not have any right of converting their shares into equity. As simple as that to understand. The next is on the basis of redemption. There are two types. One is redeemable, the other is irredeemable. Redeemable preference shares. These are to be purchased back by the company after a certain period as per the terms of issue. Irredeemable preference shares. These are not to be purchased by the company back during its lifetime. So if you concentrate on these terms, it will be easy for you to recall and write in your examination. So therefore, students, we have done with kinds of preference shares related to on the basis of conversion and on the basis of redemption. Let's move on. Deferred shares. Deferred shares is a share that does not have equity, any rights to the assets of the company undergoing bankruptcy. Bankruptcy means they are under loss or they have not recovered their regular profits until all common and preferred shareholders are paid. Let us repeat. A deferred share is a share that does not have any rights to the assets of the company undergoing bankruptcy. As I mentioned, bankruptcy refers to complete loss until all common and preferred shareholders are paid. These shares are held by founders or beginners of the company. The characteristics of deferred shares are as follows. Rate of dividend is not fixed. It depends upon the availability of profits. Dividend is paid after payment of dividend to equity and preference shareholders. At the time of liquidation, capital on these shares is returned after capital is repaid for both preference and equity shares. Dear students, we have understood the various types of shares. We have discussed about equity shares, types of preference shares, and types of deferred shares. This session will help you in answering the following or most likely questions in your examination. You'll be able to answer the question, give the meaning of shares. They might ask you a question about explain the various types of shares or kinds of shares. So therefore, this session will help you to write these questions in your examination. Hope this session has helped you in learning these concepts. Thank you, dear students. Thank you all once again.